"Excuse me, miss, that's for the family only," said a woman in a navy blue dress, tapping Helen lightly on the shoulder. Helen stood awkwardly by the long table, holding a simple white envelope as her gift. The woman didn't wait for Helen's reply. She simply waved a manicured hand toward the far corner of the garden, where a cluster of cheap white plastic chairs were lined up near the catering tents. "Guests like you sit over there." Without a word, Helen nodded once and moved away, her heels clicking softly against the polished stone as she crossed the decorated patio. Heads turned as she walked, and a few smirks tugged at the edges of well-made faces. Someone in a gray suit leaned toward his companion and muttered something that made her laugh behind her wineglass. Helen kept her gaze steady, her steps slow and composed. She reached the plastic chairs and chose one near the end, sitting down with a careful smoothness, as if she were settling into the finest seat in the house. She placed the white envelope gently in her lap, smoothing her skirt as a cool breeze lifted the edges. Around her, the main guest area buzzed with life. Women in flowing dresses twirled their hair and sipped champagne. Men adjusted their cufflinks and laughed at private jokes. No one offered Helen a second glance. A trio of bridesmaids in blush pink walked past, giggling as they threw side glances at Helen's plain dress and modest shoes. One of them bumped another and whispered too loudly, "Must have gotten lost on the way to the service entrance." Helen's fingers tightened slightly around the envelope, but she didn't respond. Instead, she shifted her chair a little to one side, finding a better view of the archway wrapped in fresh flowers where the ceremony would take place. Music from a live quartet floated through the air, and the guests began settling into their assigned velvet chairs. Helen sat alone, watching as the groom's party strutted in, fixing their jackets and flashing broad smiles. A server carrying a tray of sparkling wine passed close to her, but didn't offer a glass. Helen only smiled lightly to herself and folded her hands. A woman in an emerald green gown shot Helen a pitying look before quickly turning away when their eyes met. Near the altar, the bride's mother stood directing the photographer, every few seconds casting a glance toward the crowd, to ensure everything appeared perfect. When her gaze landed on Helen's plastic chair far in the back, she frowned slightly but said nothing. As the officiant took his place and the groom adjusted his tie nervously, the guests stood, heads turning expectantly. Helen rose too, brushing a few stray wrinkles from her skirt, and craned her neck a little to see better. Murmurs rippled through the gathering as the first notes of the bridal march began. From the edge of the garden, the bride appeared, radiant in white, clinging to her father's arm as they made their way slowly down the aisle. Helen clapped politely along with everyone else when the couple reached the altar, though her applause was softer, more reserved. Around her, laughter and chatter filled the air again as people settled back down. A young girl nearby twisted in her seat and stared at Helen with open curiosity, only to be shushed and turned back around by her elegantly dressed mother. When the vows were exchanged, Helen listened intently, her face calm but warm, as if the love on display was a moment she honored, even if she wasn't part of it. A man in a navy suit 2 rows ahead chuckled and muttered, "Wonder if she even knows them," earning a low laugh from his wife. The ceremony wrapped up quickly, and the crowd moved toward the reception area, a lavishly decorated space with crystal chandeliers strung between tall trees. Helen stood with the others but hung back, allowing the rush of bodies to pass. She reached for a glass of water from a tray but was gently redirected by a server, carrying champagne to the main group. She accepted it without complaint, sipping quietly at her drink. At the gift table, glittering packages and thick, gold-embossed cards were stacked high. Helen stepped forward and placed her plain white envelope among them. A woman near the table raised an eyebrow but said nothing, offering a tight, rehearsed smile as Helen turned away. The wedding organizer in the navy blue dress spotted her again and bustled over, a fresh clipboard in hand. "We're trying to keep the gift photos looking consistent," she said with a strained smile. "Could you perhaps move yours underneath the others?" She gestured vaguely, not meeting Helen's eyes. Helen gave a small nod and gently slid her envelope beneath the glossy boxes and silver ribbons without argument. "Thank you," the woman said briskly, already turning back toward the photographers setting up nearby. Helen returned to her plastic chair as the reception began in full. Laughter erupted from a nearby cluster as a groomsman recounted some story too loudly. Champagne flowed freely, and waiters weaved between the tables carrying gleaming trays. Helen sat quietly, occasionally clapping at the speeches, occasionally smiling when a child ran shrieking past her, chasing bubbles that floated above the dance floor. She looked at her phone once, briefly, checking the time before sliding it back into her small, worn clutch. Across the lawn, a group of women in matching pastel gowns took selfies, ensuring the backdrop of roses and fairy lights framed them perfectly. One of them caught sight of Helen sitting alone and nudged her friend. A ripple of laughter passed between them, soft but unmistakable. Before we go further into Helen's story, take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more true emotional journeys just like this one. It's moments like these that remind us appearances are only half the story. Helen adjusted her seat slightly, her posture still graceful, her expression still kind. Alone among the glitter and glass, she seemed almost like an island, untouched by the ocean of glances and whispers washing over her. Dinner was announced with a soft chiming of silver bells, and the crowd eagerly shifted toward the long banquet tables set under cascading lights. Helen waited patiently at the edge, letting the crush of guests move first. When the line thinned, she made her way toward the tables, where place cards glittered beside golden charger plates. Her name, however, was nowhere to be found. A server, looking harried, approached and gestured apologetically toward a small side table near the kitchen entrance. "Ma'am, you can sit right over here," he said, pulling out a plastic chair tucked beside a hastily set table with none of the elaborate decorations the main tables had. Helen offered him a gentle smile and thanked him as if he had just shown her to a seat of honor. She placed her clutch carefully beside her plate and folded her hands neatly in her lap. From her corner she watched as the main guests sat at tables draped in white linens, floral centerpieces towering between them, laughter and champagne flowing as freely as the music. Near the front, a lavish display caught her eye. On a side platform decorated with candles and framed photos of the couple, a mountain of wedding gifts gleamed in the light, shiny bags from luxury stores, polished boxes wrapped in silk ribbons, massive packages adorned with gold seals. Tucked in the far corner of the stage, half hidden behind a pillar, lay a small white envelope, alone and unremarkable. Helen recognized it immediately. It hadn't been placed with the others. It had been set apart, almost deliberately out of view. As she took a sip of water from the plain glass in front of her, a sudden loud laugh erupted from the bride's table. The bride's mother, resplendent in emerald satin, raised her glass high, speaking loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Isn't it something?" she said, laughing. "Some people really think a card counts as a gift. No sense of what matters at a wedding, I suppose." Several guests chuckled awkwardly, darting glances at each other, some shifting uncomfortably, but none daring to confront her. Helen's eyes flickered briefly toward the sound, but she showed no reaction. Instead, she placed her glass down quietly and thanked a young server who approached with a basket of warm rolls. The server, a boy barely out of his teens, hesitated for a moment as he caught the warmth in her eyes, the genuine kindness in her voice. He nodded mutely, his hand trembling slightly as he set the basket down. Helen gave him a small nod of gratitude that seemed far too grand for the small, forgotten corner she occupied. The dinner service began, plates of elegantly plated entrees floating past her toward the main tables. Helen's own plate arrived, simple roasted chicken with a small side of vegetables, set without fanfare. She accepted it without complaint, carefully arranging her napkin across her lap as the guests at the grand tables clinked glasses and shouted toasts across the lawn. The young server hovered nearby, eyes flickering between the extravagant center and the woman sitting quietly in the shadows. He watched as Helen picked up her fork with the grace of someone accustomed to quieter rooms, not grand ballrooms. He watched as she thanked each server that approached her, no matter how distracted or rushed they seemed. He noticed how she never let her smile falter, even when a group of bridesmaids, tipsy and bold, pointed openly at her table and laughed behind their hands. From the corner of the reception, a photographer snapped endless pictures of the glittering crowd. Helen's side of the garden was left in shadow, no flashes capturing her presence, no candid laughter caught in her frame. When the cake was brought out, a towering confection of sugar roses and gold leaf, Helen set her fork down and applauded softly along with the others. No one noticed. After the first slices were served to the head table, the crowd surged toward the buffet for their share. Helen waited, letting the wave pass before rising carefully from her chair. She moved with quiet steps toward the dessert table, where the young server stood behind a tray of pastries. He stiffened slightly when he saw her approach, but Helen simply smiled and asked, "May I?" Her voice was low, kind. The boy nodded quickly and, without thinking, offered her the first pick from the fresh tray instead of the picked-over remains. Helen selected a small tart and thanked him again, her gratitude sincere. As she turned back toward her lonely table, a gust of laughter broke out from the main floor. One of the groomsmen had started a game of charades, and the crowd hooted and clapped as he made exaggerated gestures. Helen paused for a moment, the laughter brushing over her like a wave she could never quite catch. Then she sat down again, savoring her pastry with delicate bites. The server watched her from the corner, seeing something no one else seemed to notice, a woman who carried herself with more dignity in exile than most did at the center of the celebration. Time dragged on, and the festivities grew louder. Couples twirled under the fairy lights. Grandparents posed for pictures. Children, in miniature suits, darted between tables, squealing with glee. Helen remained in her seat, content to observe, her presence as soft and constant as the breeze moving through the trees. After a while, she pulled her clutch into her lap and quietly opened it, revealing a phone with a scratched case. She tapped the screen once, checking the time. The faintest flicker of anticipation crossed her face, so quick and subtle that it could have been missed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. The young server, wiping his hands nervously on his apron, saw it. He didn't understand what it meant, but he knew instinctively that Helen wasn't just waiting idly like the others for cake or speeches. She was waiting for something more. Helen tucked her phone away, settled her purse again, and returned, her gaze to the crowded, glittering scene before her, a small, knowing smile resting on her lips like a secret she was content to keep for now. As the sun dipped lower and the fairy lights blinked into brighter focus, the energy of the wedding shifted from structured ceremony to loose, easy celebration. Guests laughed louder now, fueled by cocktails and stories, their shoes abandoned near the dance floor as they moved freely under the open sky. Helen remained at her modest plastic table, her posture calm, her presence quiet, untouched by the chaos unfolding across the garden. Glasses clinked, chairs scraped against the stone, and bursts of laughter rose and fell like waves crashing around her. But no one approached. At one point, a man in a rumpled linen suit stumbled toward Helen's table, balancing 3 empty glasses in his hand. His eyes squinted, confused as he looked at her simple dress and the empty plates near her. "Hey, can you clear this up?" he said, placing the glasses loudly on the corner of her table before walking away without waiting for a response. Several heads turned, catching the exchange, and a few muffled chuckles broke out from a nearby group of guests. Helen sat still for a moment, the corners of her mouth lifting just slightly. Without a trace of bitterness, she carefully stood, picked up the glasses, and walked them over to the nearest catering station. A staff member reached for them immediately, looking embarrassed, but Helen just gave a small nod and returned to her seat as if nothing had happened. The young server, the same one who had offered her pastries earlier, watched this unfold from his post near the drink station. His grip tightened momentarily around the tray he was holding. Setting it down, he picked up a fresh glass of lemonade and, weaving through the crowd, approached Helen's table. Without a word, he placed the glass gently before her, nodding respectfully. Helen looked up, her smile genuine, and said softly, Thank you." The boy gave a quick, shy grin before retreating back to his duties, his face a little flushed. Helen picked up the glass, taking a slow sip as she surveyed the party around her. The guests were deep in their own glittering world, posing for selfies against the floral arches, crowding the open bar, sneaking into the photo booth 2 and 3 at a time. She remained a still figure in the corner, unnoticed yet somehow central, like a single brushstroke that gave depth to an otherwise loud painting. Her phone buzzed again inside her clutch. Helen slipped it open discreetly, shielding the screen with her hand. The name flashing on the display was clear in the glow of the screen. Captain Anders. She let the call ring through without answering, only glancing once toward the sky beyond the garden where the lights faded into the darkening evening. The young server, balancing a tray of champagne flutes nearby, caught the glimpse of her screen, his brow furrowed slightly. "Captain?" His mind turned the word over, confused but intrigued. He watched as Helen tucked the phone away once more, her face serene, her movements deliberate. She was waiting for something none of the other guests even sensed was coming. A group of women in jewel-toned dresses burst into laughter near the dessert table, spilling their drinks as they playfully shoved one another. One of them pointed directly at Helen, whispering something behind her hand. Another nodded, tossing her hair back and smirking openly. Helen turned her head slightly, as if drawn by instinct, and caught their eyes for a brief second. Instead of looking away embarrassed, she held their gaze steadily, her expression unreadable but strong. The women faltered, their laughter dying off into uncomfortable silence before they turned sharply away, pretending to be absorbed by the cake cutting. A DJ had begun setting up near the main lawn, filling the garden with the low thump of bass and cheerful pop songs. Couples dragged each other onto the dance floor, swaying and spinning under the twinkling lights. The party had fully shifted now, the solemnity of vows forgotten, replaced by the heady abandon of celebration. Helen stayed seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her purse resting lightly by her side. Another buzz came from her clutch. Helen opened it a crack, checking again. "Captain Anders," flashed once more. She silenced it quickly, her face calm, though her fingers tapped a slow rhythm against her glass, an unconscious beat only she seemed to know. The young server approached again, this time carrying a tray with slices of cake. As he bent to offer one to a passing guest, he glanced toward Helen's table. She caught his eye briefly and gave him another small smile, one that seemed to carry more weight than 100 loud cheers. Without waiting for her to ask, he made his way over, setting a delicate slice of cake on the small plastic table in front of her. "Fresh," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Helen's eyes softened, and she whispered, "Thank you again," as if he had offered her a crown instead of confection. As he moved back toward his post, he glanced over his shoulder, once, just once, to watch her place her fork into the cake with slow, deliberate care. She was savoring it, not because it was sweet, but because it was given without pity. The wedding had become a blur of noise now. Somewhere near the main stage, the groom's friends had formed a circle, chanting and clapping as someone attempted to perform a clumsy breakdance. Near the open bar, older relatives were pulling chairs together for long, tipsy conversations. In the midst of all the celebration, no one seemed to notice the helicopter lights blinking faintly in the distant sky, growing larger. Helen lifted, her glass to her lips, her posture still perfect, her presence still quiet and powerful. Her phone buzzed a final time, the name Captain Anders glowing insistently on the screen. This time Helen allowed herself a slight, almost imperceptible, nod before tucking it away again. She sat back in her chair, the noise of the party rolling over her without touching her. The server, watching from his station, knew without knowing why that something was about to shift, something no amount of champagne or gold-trimmed invitations could predict. The DJ's voice crackled through the speakers, pulling the laughter and music into a new focus. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his tone bright and practiced, "it's time for a very special moment. We invite only immediate family to the dance floor for the first family dance." A light cheer rippled across. The garden as guests turned their heads, clapping and smiling. Chairs scraped back, bodies shifted, and family members in elegant gowns and sharp tuxedos gathered in the center, forming a circle under the fairy lights. Helen stood up automatically, setting her purse carefully on her chair. For a moment, it seemed she was going to join them. Her eyes shone softly in the glow of the overhead lights as she adjusted her simple dress and smoothed her hair behind one ear. But before she could take a step forward, a woman with a clipboard, another wedding planner, approached her quickly, offering a tight smile. "Excuse me, ma'am. Family only, please," she said, in a voice too loud to be discreet. Several nearby guests heard, their heads turning slightly in curiosity. Helen paused, one hand lightly resting against her side, and for the briefest second, something raw flickered across her face. Sadness, perhaps, or something deeper, something heavier. But just as quickly, it was gone. She nodded with quiet grace and stepped back, folding her hands in front of her. The crowd didn't notice the small exchange for long. The music swelled, and the family dance began, spinning the main players of the evening into the spotlight while the rest of the guests watched from the sidelines. Helen moved slowly away from the dance floor, her steps measured and deliberate. She didn't rush, nor did she let her shoulders slump, though the weight pressing down on her seemed almost visible to anyone paying enough attention. Near the edge of the patio, where the lights thinned and the noise of the party grew softer, Helen found a quiet spot beneath a canopy of vines. She pulled her clutch from under her arm and opened it, fingers brushing across the familiar worn surface of her phone. She unlocked it swiftly and began typing, her expression calm but focused. Her thumb moved quickly across the screen, sending a brief message before she tucked the device back inside with a soft click. Across the lawn, the young server who had offered her the lemonade earlier watched from his place near the bar. He had noticed the small confrontation by the dance floor, the way Helen had been asked to step aside, and the way she had managed to do it without allowing her dignity to crumble. His tray hung forgotten in his hand as he stared toward her. Drawn not by pity but by something closer to admiration, he could tell, without understanding why, that she wasn't humiliated in the way others might have been. She carried the sadness without letting it define her. Helen leaned lightly against one of the stone columns supporting the canopy, gazing out across the garden. The music swirled around her, bright and lively, but she seemed almost outside of it, as if wrapped in her own steady world. Every so often her eyes would flick toward the sky, tracing the faint blinking lights still growing larger on the distant horizon. Behind her the wedding moved on. The MC announced another round of toasts. Laughter erupted near the main tables. Someone dropped a glass, and the sharp sound of shattering punctuated the air before being swallowed by the noise. Helen barely flinched. She remained poised, one hand resting against the stone, her breathing slow and even. The light caught in her hair, turning it into a soft halo against the darkening night. The young server shifted awkwardly, uncertain whether he should approach again. In the end, he simply stood nearby, pretending to rearrange the glasses on the bar, his eyes never straying far from Helen. He saw the way she lifted her head slightly, listening, waiting. He saw the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a small motion filled with quiet strength. And he noticed the way she checked her clutch once more, glancing at the screen briefly, her thumb hovering over it, before sliding it shut again without another word. Another announcement blared through the speakers, this time inviting all guests to join for the next dance. The floor filled quickly with couples, their bodies weaving together under the sparkling lights. Helen remained where she was, a steady figure at the edge, her silhouette framed by vines and moonlight. The young server finally moved, stepping forward with slow, careful steps. He didn't know what he intended to say or do, only that the pull to acknowledge her was stronger than his fear of breaching the invisible walls the wedding had built around her. But before he could reach her, Helen straightened, glancing toward the entrance of the garden with a small, almost imperceptible nod. The server followed her gaze instinctively. At first he saw nothing. Then faintly, headlights cut through the darkness beyond the decorative trees lining the estate's perimeter. Not car headlights. No, They moved differently, slower, more rhythmic. Helen watched them with a composed focus, her body still, her expression unreadable, but full of quiet certainty. The server hesitated, his hand still resting on the tray, heart beating faster without knowing why. Something was about to happen. He could feel it, like the way the air shifts before a storm. Helen stepped back from the column, smoothing the front of her dress once more. She adjusted her clutch under her arm and, with a final glance over the gathering of guests who had spent the night pretending she didn't exist, she turned toward the shadows leading out of the main garden. The server stood frozen in place, the tray slipping slightly in his grasp. He watched her go, feeling somehow that she wasn't leaving out of defeat. She was leaving because she had always been meant for something beyond what these glittering tables and flashing cameras could offer. Helen's figure disappeared into the darker pathways just as the music rose again behind her, louder and faster, the celebration reaching its fevered pitch. No one noticed her slip away. No one, except a young boy in a catering uniform, standing silently among the rows of champagne glasses, wondering who she really was, and what the rest of them had missed entirely. The music pulsed louder, filling the night air with beats heavy enough to vibrate the glasses on the tables. Guests clapped and spun each other around on the dance floor, oblivious to the faint but growing thudding from above. At first it blended into the music, a distant bass line that no one paid attention to. But as it grew louder, heavier, the beats no longer matched the rhythm of the DJ's set. Heads began to lift. The crowd's movement slowed. Someone pointed upward, squinting into the dark sky just beyond the halo of the string lights. A deep, mechanical thudding echoed over the garden, rhythmic and unmistakable. Guests shielded their eyes, peering up as the blades of a helicopter cut through the night, its searchlights blinking across the manicured lawns. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter faltered. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. The entire celebration seemed to pause under the growing roar. The DJ, momentarily confused, fumbled with his microphone. Must be someone getting lost on the way," he joked weakly, but no one laughed. The guests started to move, some stepping off the dance floor, others drifting toward the edges of the garden, craning their necks to get a better view. The thudding grew deafening as the helicopter descended lower, circling once over the estate before moving toward a flat, open space just beyond the carefully landscaped hedges, a private helipad built for the estate's rarest and most prestigious visitors. Helen stood at the edge of the garden, her silhouette still and composed beneath the vines. She watched the approaching helicopter without surprise, her expression unreadable as the powerful machine kicked up wind and loose petals from the rose bushes. Dresses flared wildly, hair whipped into faces, hands flew up to shield eyes from the sudden gusts. A few guests gasped as the helicopter settled onto the helipad with a heavy, ground-shaking thud. Doors snapped open. A figure in a crisp, dark uniform stepped out, adjusting his cap against the blowing wind. Without hesitation, he moved toward the edge of the landing zone, scanning the crowd with sharp, practiced eyes. His gaze found Helen instantly. He stepped forward, saluted sharply, and called out in a voice that cut cleanly through the stunned silence, "Miss Helen Carter, your ride is ready." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Dozens of faces turned at once toward Helen, their mouths parting, their brows furrowing. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire garden had frozen mid-breath, the glasses still trembling in guests' hands. The bride's mother, standing near the main table, gawked openly, one hand gripping her champagne, flute so tightly the glass threatened to snap. The bridesmaids who had giggled earlier now stared wide-eyed, their lip-glossed mouths hanging open. The groomsmen exchanged stunned glances, their earlier bravado evaporating in the swirling dust. Helen moved then, slow and steady, as if she were immune to the chaos spinning around her. She lifted her clutch under her arm, adjusted her skirt once with a graceful hand, and began walking toward the landing area. Her steps were measured, unfaltering, and utterly silent against the stunned noise of the crowd. The young server stood near the dessert table, a half-cleared tray in his hands, his heart thudding almost as loudly as the helicopter had. He watched, unmoving, as Helen crossed the patio, her simple dress whipping slightly around her legs. He noticed how she didn't rush, didn't glance around seeking approval or acknowledgement. She simply moved forward with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly who she was. As Helen passed the rows of stunned guests, a few instinctively stepped back, as if clearing a path without realizing it. Others just stood, rooted to the spot, their faces a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and disbelief. The same woman who had been relegated to a plastic chair, who had been overlooked, laughed at, and whispered about, now commanded the entire attention of the room without a single word. At the edge of the helipad, the pilot stepped forward again and opened the helicopter door with a polished gesture. Helen nodded once in acknowledgement. Before stepping in, she paused, turning slightly toward the crowd. Her gaze swept over them, not with malice or triumph, but with a calm, distant grace that somehow made the moment even sharper. The server caught her eye for a brief second. He felt it like a small jolt. An unspoken thank you, perhaps, or simply the recognition of someone who had seen his quiet respect earlier. He lowered his head slightly, acknowledging her in return. Helen stepped into the helicopter, settling into the seat with effortless composure. The pilot closed the door behind her and moved back to the front. Engines whirred louder, the blades picking up speed, and soon the helicopter began to rise, kicking up another wave of wind across the garden. Guests stumbled back, shielding themselves again. Hair whipped across makeup, tablecloths flapped wildly, and the towering wedding cake tilted dangerously on its pedestal. In the middle of it all, heads craned upward, eyes wide with awe and shame, as the helicopter carrying Helen rose higher into the night sky. The server stood motionless, his tray forgotten at his side. His eyes stayed fixed on the shrinking machine. As it climbed above the estate, lights blinking steadily against the darkness. Around him the murmuring began, a ripple of shocked whispers, heads shaking, hands gesturing wildly. "Who was she?" someone said near the bar. "Did you see that? Did you see that pilot salute her?" Another voice answered, thick with disbelief. The bride's mother pressed a hand to her chest, color draining from her face. The groom and bride exchanged stiff glances, their earlier laughter gone, replaced by a stunned silence that weighed heavier than any speech or toast could have. The young server finally set his tray down on a table, watching the last blinking lights of the helicopter fade into the stars. A slow smile spread across his face, not one of mockery or amazement, but one of quiet satisfaction. They had seen her now. Not the dress she wore, not the chair she had been given, not the envelope tucked beneath gold-wrapped gifts. They had seen the weight she carried and the power she never needed to show. Helen Carter had left the wedding exactly the way she had arrived, on her own terms. The helicopter blades slowed as it idled on the private helipad, a low hum vibrating across the field. The guests stood scattered across the lawn, stunned into an awkward, lingering silence. The sparkle of champagne glasses and the gleam of jewelry seemed to dull under the weight of realization settling over the garden. No one knew what to say. For long minutes they simply stared at the woman who had just shattered every assumption they had so carelessly made. From the corner of the reception tent, the bride's mother snapped out of her daze first. She smoothed the front of her emerald gown with shaky hands, checked her hair with a quick pat, and plastered a wide, forced smile across her face. Without hesitation, she began weaving her way through the crowd toward the helipad, her heels clicking against the stones with growing urgency. Several guests turned to watch her, curiosity replacing shock. The DJ, sensing the tension but not understanding it, let the music fade into a low background hum. Helen stood near the helicopter's open door, her back straight, her hands loosely clasped in front of her clutch. She didn't turn to look as the woman approached, didn't shift or fidget under the growing attention. She simply waited, composed and unreadable, as if she had all the time in the world. "Oh, there you are, darling," the bride's mother called out, her voice bright and brittle. She approached with outstretched arms, moving as though greeting an old family friend, instead of a woman she had humiliated just hours earlier. "We were wondering where you'd gone off to. You mustn't leave yet. We were just about to cut the cake." Her laughter was light, practiced, but there was a strain underneath it, a desperate note that didn't go unnoticed by the surrounding guests. Helen turned her head slightly, meeting the woman's gaze with a quiet, polite smile. The bride's mother reached for her arm, but Helen took a half-step back, just enough to make it clear without being unkind. The pilot standing by the helicopter watched silently, his face unreadable behind his sunglasses despite the darkness, settling over the estate. "Thank you," Helen said, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned crowd. It wasn't loud, but it was strong, each word placed carefully. "That's very kind of you." She let the words hang there for a moment, letting the false warmth dissolve between them before continuing. "But I wasn't meant to stay long." A murmur rippled through the guests. Heads turned, shoulders shifted. People leaned closer as if drawn forward by invisible strings. The shift was palpable. Something real had cracked open between the polished laughter and the silk dresses, something that no amount of decorations or carefully staged moments could paper over. The bride's mother faltered, her smile slipping, for a fraction of a second. "But surely just a little longer? After all, we're family tonight, aren't we?" She gestured vaguely toward the crowd, where the bride and groom now stood stiffly, watching from a distance. Helen inclined her head, still smiling, but there was a distance in her eyes that even the most oblivious onlooker could not mistake. "Tonight belongs to your family," she said softly. "I wouldn't want to intrude." Her voice was neither cold nor bitter. It was simply factual, delivered with a grace that made the surrounding whispers grow heavier. The young server near the drink station watched the exchange unfold, his hands tightening around the edge of the tablecloth. He wasn't the only one who saw it. The dignity Helen carried, the way she stood not above them, but apart, untouched by the glamour and the cruelty alike. The admiration building among the guests was unspoken, but undeniable, a low, rising wave that started with stolen glances and tightened throats. One of the older guests, a man with silver hair and a tailored navy suit, murmured something to his wife, who nodded solemnly. A bridesmaid near the dessert table bit her lip, suddenly fascinated with the hem of her expensive gown. Even the groom shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a helpless glance with the bride, whose smile had frozen into something brittle and panicked. Helen offered a small nod to the bride's mother, then turned her attention fully back to the pilot. The man responded instantly, stepping forward and opening the helicopter door wider. Helen walked toward it without another glance behind her. She didn't need to look back to know that every pair of eyes was following her now, not with judgment, but with something closer to awe. As she reached the open door, she paused, resting one hand lightly on the frame. The rotor blades spun lazily overhead, stirring her hair around her face like a halo. She turned slightly, offering the guests one final look. Not a wave, not a grand farewell, just a calm, steady glance that landed like a quiet verdict. The young server caught her eye again from across the lawn. He gave the smallest nod, almost invisible, and Helen's smile warmed by a degree before she stepped gracefully into the cabin. The pilot secured the door behind her, moved to the cockpit, and within seconds the helicopter began to lift off the ground, rising steadily into the night. Wind whipped across the garden, sending paper napkins skittering, overturning empty champagne glasses, and lifting the edges of the tablecloths. Guests shielded their faces, their hair, but no one moved from their place. They stood still, heads tilted upward, watching the woman they had dismissed, whispered about, and overlooked rise into the darkening sky like a queen leaving a court, unworthy of her. The sound of the helicopter faded slowly, swallowed by the stars. The guests remained silent long after the lights had vanished, their party gowns and tuxedos sagging slightly as if weighed down by the sudden gravity of the night. It wasn't the music that resumed first, or the clinking of glasses, or even the desperate chatter of the planners trying to salvage the evening. It was a single voice near the back, a young woman in a simple dress, whispering to no one in particular. "We had no idea." And in the silence that followed, it was clear. No one else had either. The helicopter climbed higher into the night sky, its lights blinking against the dark as the estate below shrank into a patchwork of shadows and glimmering lights. The roar of the blades faded slowly, leaving behind a vacuum of silence that blanketed the stunned guests. For a few long moments, no one spoke. No one moved. They stood rooted where they were, the evening's laughter and music forgotten, their champagne glasses hanging limp at their sides. Only the faint hum of the engines echoed in their ears, and even that soon dissolved into nothing. Down below, the garden looked oddly different now, stripped of its earlier glamour. The fairy lights still twinkled, but they seemed colder, harsher, as if even the decorations were ashamed of the night's events. The bride's mother remained frozen near the center of the patio, her carefully crafted smile gone, replaced by a tight line of regret she didn't know how to mask. Around her, clusters of guests whispered in hushed, broken conversations, their earlier bravado drained into awkward silence. Near the drink station, the young server set his tray down carefully, wiping his hands on his apron even though they weren't wet. He watched the last fading light of the helicopter vanish into the sky, a small, genuine smile pulling at his lips. Unlike the others, he wasn't confused or embarrassed. He was inspired. Where everyone else had seen an ordinary woman unworthy of their attention, he had seen her grace in the smallest gestures, her patience, her kindness, her unwavering poise. She had carried herself with a quiet authority that no amount of luxury or titles could replicate. The boy stood there for a long time, smiling to himself, feeling somehow that he had witnessed something far bigger than a wedding could ever offer. Something about the way she had handled everything. Being asked to move, being mistaken for staff, being dismissed and humiliated, without a single outburst, without a single plea for recognition. She hadn't needed anyone's permission to carry dignity. She had worn it as effortlessly as breathing. Guests slowly began to shift, their movements hesitant. Some pretended to fix their hair or adjust their suits. Others murmured about the helicopter, speculating about who Helen really was. The bride and groom stood awkwardly near the head table, trying to summon the energy to smile again for the photographers. But the mood had irrevocably changed. The sparkle of the evening had dulled, replaced by something heavier, something they couldn't quite shake off. The music stuttered back on, but no one rushed to the dance floor. No one raised a toast. A few guests wandered aimlessly toward the dessert table, nibbling half-heartedly at pastries they no longer tasted. Every glance, every whisper, carried the same silent message. We misjudged her. We failed to see. Near the service tent, the young server finished stacking the last of the empty glasses. He paused once more, staring out over the dark stretch of lawn where Helen had walked so calmly toward the helicopter. He tucked the memory away carefully, almost reverently, knowing that years from now it would still be vivid, the woman who showed them all what true grace looked like without ever needing to say a word. As the evening struggled awkwardly to resume, the young boy lifted a fresh tray and moved among the guests with renewed purpose. He no longer saw himself as invisible. Helen had taught him that value wasn't granted by a fancy seat or an expensive suit. It was something quieter, deeper, worn in how one stood when the world tried to shrink them down. They had given her a plastic chair to remind her she didn't belong. She left in a way they'd never forget. If Helen's journey moved you even half as much as it moved those who witnessed it, take a moment to honor true strength and dignity. Like this story, share it with someone who needs a reminder that real worth is never determined by the crowd. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real human stories that stay with you long after the lights fade. The night carried on, but it was no longer the bride's gown or the gilded centerpieces people would remember. It was the quiet woman in the plain dress, the one who rose above them all, without ever needing to step on a single soul to do it.